The telltale crack of a gunshot, sharp and sudden, did little to stir Mason Reed from his stupor. He sat on a hard wooden bench inside the Redemption First Bank, oblivious to the nervous shifting of the other patrons, lost in the polished gleam of the silver locket cradled in his palm. It was a simple thing, an oval of tarnished metal etched with the image of a single desert rose. Inside, a miniature portrait of his wife Sarah smiled back at him. Her red hair a fiery halo, her eyes full of the life that had been stolen from them both. 3 years. 3 years of dust and silence, of wearing a marshal's badge that felt more like a shroud than a symbol of justice. Another shot, closer this time, splintered the frame of the bank's front door. A woman screamed. The spell broke. Mason's head snapped up, his hand instinctively closing around the locket, tucking it back beneath his shirt. The world came rushing back in a chaotic blur of panicked motion and the acrid smell of gunpowder. 4 men, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, stormed into the bank. They moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice, their voices harsh commands that cut through the terrified silence. On the floor now, Mason, caught between the instinct of a lawman and the inertia of a grieving man, remained seated. He was just passing through Redemption, a ghost drifting from one desolate town to the next, his pursuit of meaning as barren as the landscape outside. He wasn't on duty. He wasn't anything. One of the outlaws, a mountain of a man with a wild red beard and eyes like chips of cold blue ice, noticed him. "You deaf old man," I said on the floor. The outlaw strode toward him, leveling a shotgun with ornate silver inlay at Mason's chest. Slowly, Mason raised his hands, his gaze flat and empty. The man's eyes narrowed, flickering down to the faint silver chain, visible at the collar of Mason's shirt. With a sudden vicious tug, he ripped the locket free. The chain snapped, stinging Mason's neck. The small silver oval, the last tangible piece of his wife, fell into the outlaw's gloved hand. "Well, now what's this?" the man drawled, his lips curling into a cruel smirk. He thumbed the locket open. Pretty thing, both of them. He glanced from the portrait to Mason, a flicker of something recognition perhaps in his eyes. Then he pocketed it. Something ignited in the hollow space where Mason's heart used to be. A cold, clean fire. The grief that had paralyzed him for 3 years was instantly burned away, replaced by a singular clarifying rage. He wasn't a marshal. He wasn't a widower. He was the man whose last connection to his wife had just been stolen. The robbery was over in moments. The outlaws stuffed saddlebags with cash, backing out of the bank with their guns still trained on the terrified patrons. The red-bearded man gave Mason a final mocking salute before disappearing into the dust-choked street. For a moment, the bank was silent, save for the quiet sobbing of the teller. Then Mason moved. He rose from the bench, his movements fluid and economical. The scar that traced a path from his left temple to his jaw pulled tight, a stark white line against his sun-darkened skin. He walked out of the bank, ignoring the town sheriff who was just arriving, shouting questions. Mason's world had shrunk to a single point of focus, the trail of 4 horses heading east into the unforgiving wilderness of the Arizona Territory. He swung himself into the saddle of his own horse, a powerful buckskin that had carried him through countless pursuits. The hunt was on. But this wasn't for bounty, and it wasn't for the law. It was for a memory. It was for Sarah. For 2 days, he rode, pushing himself and his horse to the limits of their endurance. The trail was easy to follow the outlaws, confident in their escape. Mason was a wraith fueled by coffee-dried beef and the cold fire in his gut. He was once the most feared bounty hunter in the territory, a man who could track a whisper on the wind. That man had been dormant for 3 years, but the theft of the locket had reawakened him. The instincts were still there, sharp and honed. He read the story of their passage in the broken creosote, the depth of the hoofprints, the careless remains of their camps. On the third day, the trail took an unexpected turn. It led him not to a hideout or canyon ambush, but to a solitary ancient cottonwood tree standing skeletal against the brassy sky. And from its thickest branch, 5 figures hung, their feet dangling just inches above the cracked earth. Dust swirled as Mason swung a boot over his saddle. He landed with a soft thud, the wind whipping the edges of his leather duster like a frayed flag. He drew closer, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. They were women. Apache women. Ropes bit into their wrists, raw and bleeding. Their faces were bruised, their clothes torn, but their eyes, when they turned to him, held not just desperation, but a defiant fire. Water, the eldest one, rasped, her voice a dry whisper. Her gaze was direct, measuring him. Please. He unhooked his canteen, his lawman's caution, warring with a more basic human instinct. He had a long and complicated history with the Apache. He had hunted them for bounty in his younger days, learning their ways, their language, and their resilience in the process. He drew his knife, a weathered blade that had seen too much, and approached the first woman. Who did this to you? He asked, his voice rough from days of disuse. She didn't answer as he sawed through the thick rope. Her body slumped against his lighter than he expected, but her grip on his arm was surprisingly strong. He helped her to the ground before moving to the next and the next, until all 5 were free. They were sisters, he guessed, from the shared high cheekbones and intense dark eyes. They huddled together, passing his canteen between them, each taking a single, disciplined sip. My name is Marshal Mason Reed, he said, keeping his distance. We know who you are. The eldest sister interrupted, her voice gaining strength. The man with the scar. The hunter of Apache. Mason's hand went unconsciously to his cheek, to the old knife wound that served as a permanent reminder of the man he once was. That was a long time ago. Not so long for those you hunted, she replied, but without the venom he expected. She stood unsteady but proud. I am Nahima. These are my sisters, Kimla, Orenda, Halona, and Tuluta. Each sister acknowledged her name with a nod. Kimla, the second eldest, glared at him with undisguised hostility. You tracked our father, Nahima stated, her eyes unwavering. James Thunderheart, 15 years ago. The name surfaced from his memory. Thunderheart, a brilliant warrior who had led him on the longest, most difficult chase of his career. A chase that had ended not in capture, but in a strange, unspoken stalemate of mutual respect at the edge of a canyon. He was a good man, Mason said, the words surprising him with their sincerity. He said you were the only white man who understood the desert, Nahima said. Kimla spat on the ground. We should kill him anyway, she said in Apache. Mason's grasp of the language was rusty, but he understood the sentiment. No, Nahima replied, her voice sharp, switching back to English for his benefit. He is not the same man. His spirit is wounded. Mason looked away, uncomfortable with the accuracy of her perception. Who did this? He asked again, gesturing to the rope still dangling from the tree. The same men you are tracking, Nahima answered. Men with a flame-shaped scar on their leader's hand. The description solidified the connection. The red-bearded man, Samuel Blackburn. That was the name on the wanted posters. You've seen them. They destroyed our village, Nahima said, her voice hardening with grief and rage. They murdered our people. They were looking for something our father protected. What? The sisters exchanged a silent, weighted glance. Finally, Nahima spoke. Knowledge. Maps not on paper, but in memory. the location of the ancestors' waters of the underground rivers that have sustained our people for centuries. Mason had heard the legends. Most dismissed them as superstition. But in this parched land, then the idea of controlling a secret water source was a motive more powerful than gold. And your attackers? They call themselves the Flame Society, Nahima said. Led by Blackburn. He serves a more powerful man, a politician who seeks to control this whole territory. A man named Donovan Hayes. The name was familiar. A rising star in territorial politics, sheriff of a boomtown called Copper Springs, campaigning on a platform of progress and pacifying the Apache. These men, Mason set his voice tight, the leader Blackburn. He wears a silver locket, a desert rose etched on the front. Nahima's eyes widened in recognition. He boasted of it. A trophy, he called it. Taken from a nosy reporter, he silenced for his boss. The cold fire in Mason's gut blazed. Sarah. She had been investigating water rights deals and corrupt politicians before she died. She had mentioned threats from a secret society. The pieces slammed together in his mind with the force of a physical blow. The fire hadn't been an accident. Blackburn had murdered his wife on Hayes's orders, and he had taken her locket as a trophy. His personal quest for a stolen memento had just become a hunt for his wife's killers. He looked at the 5 women, at their bruised faces and the fierce, unyielding grief in their eyes. Their tragedy was now his own. Their enemies were his enemies. They went east from here. Kimla said, her hostility toward him momentarily forgotten in the face of their shared foe, towards Copper Springs. Then that's where we're going, Mason stated. It was no longer a question. Nahima studied him, her gaze piercing. Your hunt is for vengeance, Marshal Reed. It's for justice, he corrected, though the line between the two had never felt so thin. They are often the same path, Nahima conceded. She stepped forward, extending a hand that was steady and strong. We propose an alliance. Your knowledge of the white man's world, our knowledge of the land, and our enemy. Together, we will see this Hayes and his dog Blackburn pay for what they have done. Mason looked at her outstretched hand, and then at the faces of her sisters. He saw in them the same loss, the same burning need for resolution that now consumed him. He was no longer a ghost drifting through the desert. He had a purpose again, a terrible, righteous purpose. He took Nahima's hand. The grip was firm, a pact sealed in shared grief and a common thirst for retribution. Where do we start, he asked. We follow the trail of fire. Nahima set her eyes, turning east toward the distant, shimmering heat haze that marked the way to Copper Springs. And we burn down the man who started it. They made a cold camp that night in a hidden arroyo. The desert sky, a vast, indifferent canopy of stars. Halona, the quietest of the sisters, moved with a gentle efficiency, gathering unseen plants from the twilight landscape. She crushed them between 2 stones, creating a dark, fragrant poultice that she applied to the raw rope burns on her sister's wrists. Her touch was knowing, her movements a silent prayer. Halona speaks the language of the earth, Nahima explained, noticing Mason's attention. She sat nearby, meticulously cleaning a long rifle, its stock adorned with intricate beadwork. Each of us carries a different gift. Orenda understands the ways of towns and trading. Kimla is our warrior, our shield. Tuluta, she walks between the worlds. And you? Mason asked, turning his gaze to her. In the flickering firelight, the planes of her face were stark and proud. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I remember. Everything. Every trail, every face, every star in the sky. My father passed the gift to me. It is how we protect the knowledge of the waters. She paused, her dark eyes meeting his. It is how I remembered you. The youngest sister, Tuluta, approached the small fire. Her movements were fluid, almost dreamlike. She held a small clay bowl and, in a gesture of profound reverence, poured the last of their drinking water onto the parched ground. She honors the ancestors, Nahima said before Mason could ask. The water carries their spirits. By giving it back, we reaffirm our connection. You believe spirits reside in water? Mason's tone was skeptical, a product of a life spent dealing with tangible threats and measurable realities. Nahima looked at him, her expression unreadable. Do you not feel a difference when you stand by a running river versus a stagnant pond? Water is life, Marshall. It holds the memory of every rock it has touched, every root it has nourished. It remembers its journey just as we do. Her words resonated with a strange, dormant part of him. He thought of Sarah, of her fascination with the natural world, how she claimed she could feel the history of a place just by standing in it. Tuluta turned her unnerving gaze on him. The spirits say you carry two ghosts, Mason Reed. She said, her voice soft but resonant. The ghost of your wife who walks beside you, and the ghost of the man you used to be. Mason shifted the truth of her words a sudden weight. He didn't believe in spirits, but this girl saw through him with an unnerving clarity. As if sensing his discomfort, Kimla rose and approached her posture confrontational. Nahima may trust you, Marshall, but I do not. You hunted our people for money. How many of our fathers and brothers did you drag back in chains? I did what I thought was my job, Mason answered, his voice level. There was no point in making excuses for the man he had been. I never killed if a man could be taken alive. And what a comfort that must be to the widows of those who resisted, she sneered. That man died 3 years ago. Mason said, his voice dropping so low it was almost a whisper. He burned to death with my wife. The raw honesty of his admission seemed to startle Kimla into silence. She stared at him, her hatred warring with a flicker of grudging understanding. It was Orenda, the practical one, who broke the tense standoff. From her lookout position on the arroyo's rim, she gave a sharp, low whistle. Riders. From the east. 4 of them. Instantly, Mason kicked dirt over the fire, plunging their camp into darkness. The sisters moved with a practiced, silent urgency, gathering their few belongings, melting into the deeper shadows of the wash. Not Blackburn's men, Nahima whispered, peering over the edge. Their pace is too disciplined. Army patrol or Hayes's deputies. Either way, not friends, Mason concluded. We need to move. This way, Nahima commanded, pointing west toward a jagged silhouette of mountains against the star-dusted sky. Dead Horse Canyon. It is sacred ground. A burial place. White men fear the spirits there. They will not follow. Mason had heard the stories. A place of bleached bones and uneasy silence. He didn't believe in protective spirits, but he believed in fear. It was a tactical advantage he understood well. Nodding his assent, they mounted their horses and slipped away into the night, a small, desperate band of ghosts, guided by a woman who remembered every star. Dead Horse Canyon was a labyrinth of shadows and stone, a place where the wind whispered through bone-littered passages. The remains of ancestors rested on high ledges, their vacant eyes watching the living pass through their silent kingdom. They made camp in a sheltered box-ended canyon where a seep of clean water glistened on a rock face. Now, Mason said once they were settled, tell me everything. Why is Hayes, a white politician, so desperate to find Apache water sources? The sisters exchanged a look, and the story unfolded, a tapestry of betrayal woven in the dark. Sheriff Donovan Hayes was born Harold Thunderheart. Nahima said, the name falling like a stone into the silence. He is our father's younger brother, our uncle. The revelation stunned Mason. Your own uncle attacked your village. Our father and Harold had the same white father, but different mothers. Halona explained, her voice soft with old sorrow. Our grandmother was Morning Star, a keeper of the water knowledge. Our father James embraced his heritage. Harold despised it. He saw it as a stain that held him back from the power he craved in the white world. He changed his name, left our people, and used his knowledge of our ways to help the army hunt us. Kimla added, her voice thick with disgust. He built his career on the graves of his own kin. When our father, the last of the elders who knew his secret, died last winter, the full knowledge of the water maps passed to me. Nahima continued. Hayes Harold came to the morning ceremony. He spoke of protecting our heritage, of keeping the maps safe. We refused him. Days later, the Flame Society attacked ID. And all this time, Mason mused, the pieces clicking into place. He's been building a political empire in Copper Springs, presenting himself as the man who can finally solve the Apache problem. A problem he created and sustained, Orenda said bitterly. Mason paced the small campsite, his mind racing. He pulled a worn, leather-bound journal from his saddlebag. Sarah's. He had carried it with him for 3 years, unable to read it, the pain too raw. Now he had to know. He opened it under the moonlight, his hands trembling slightly. Her elegant script filled the page's notes on interviews, land deeds, and railroad charters. He found what he was looking for in the final entries. October 12th. The water rights acquisitions all led back to a shadowy consortium with ties to Donovan Hayes. He's using the railroad expansion as a front to seize every major water source in the territory. October 19th. A source mentioned Hayes has a secret. Something about his past. He is not who he claims to be. The name Thunderheart came up. Could there be a connection to the Apache band of the same name? I must be careful. I feel I am being watched. Then a hastily scribbled entry dated the day before the fire. October 25th. I found it. A mission record. Harold. He was born Harold. It's all true. And there's more. Something deeper. A personal connection from my childhood. I remember a quiet, angry boy my family took in for a winter. His name was Harold. He was an outcast half-blood. He became fixated on me. Could it possibly be the same man? I have to get this information to Jonathan Burke in Copper Springs. This is bigger than water, bigger than politics. It's monstrous. Mason's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a political assassination. It was personal. This man, Hayes, hadn't just killed a reporter who got too close. He had murdered the woman who represented a past. He'd tried to bury a woman who had shown him kindness, whom he had twisted into a dark obsession. He looked up from the journal, his eyes locking with Nahima's. He didn't have to speak. She saw the new terrible understanding in his face. Your wife discovered his deepest secret, she said, her voice a low whisper. She knew him. Mason choked out the words, tasting like ash. Years ago, before he was Hayes. A sudden rustle from the canyon rim sent Kimla scrambling for her rifle. Mason was on his feet in an instant, his own pistol drawn. 2 figures stood silhouetted against the stars, their forms distinctly Apache. They are not from our people, Nahima observed, studying their moccasins and the cut of their buckskins. Scouts, Mason guessed, his voice grim. Working for Hayes, he uses Apache to hunt Apache. The figures watched them for a long moment, then melted back into the rock. They hadn't attacked. They were reporting. Hayes would know where they were. He would know a marshal was traveling with the last of the Thunderhearts. We can't stay here. Orenda stated, the practical urgency returning to her voice. No, Nahima agreed. We don't run from him any longer. We go to him. We go to Copper Springs. It's his fortress, Helona cautioned. We will be walking into a trap. A trap is only a trap if the prey is unaware. Mason said, the cold fire of his purpose now burning with an intensity that left no room for fear. He tucked Sarah's journal carefully back into his saddlebag. It was no longer just a memento of his grief. It was his weapon. Hayes wants to bury his past. We're going to dig it up and show it to the world. Right in the middle of his kingdom. The journey to Copper Springs was a tense 3-day ride through a landscape that grew steadily less wild. The raw desert gave way to cattle country scarred by wagon ruts and the distant skeletal frames of telegraph poles. They traveled mostly at night, guided by Nahima's flawless memory of the terrain, resting during the brutal heat of the day in hidden arroyos and rocky overhangs. During one such stop, as the sun beat down on a cracked earth pan, turning the distant mesas into shimmering heat-distorted apparitions, Mason found himself watching the sisters. They functioned as a single organism, each part with its own purpose. Helona found a sparse, thorny plant and squeezed a few drops of milky sap onto a cloth to treat Mason's rope-chafed wrists. Orenda, ever practical, took stock of their dwindling supplies, calculating how far they could stretch their water and food. Kimla stood watch, a hawk-like figure whose gaze never ceased scanning the horizon. Tuluta sat apart, tracing patterns in the dust, her lips moving in a silent chant. Nahima came and sat beside Mason in the sliver of shade offered by a granite boulder. The air tasted of dust and smelled of sun-baked creosote. You are troubled, she observed, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. My wife knew him. Mason said, the words still tasting foreign and poisonous. When she was a girl. My family gave shelter to a half-Apache boy named Harold for a winter. He was sullen, angry at the world. Sarah, she was the only one who was kind to him. In her journal, she wrote that he became fixated on her. Nahima absorbed this, her expression grim, so when she appeared again in his life, an investigator threatening to expose him, it wasn't just about silencing a reporter. Mason finished, his voice raw. It was a reckoning with a past he thought he'd escaped. A past where he was a powerless outcast and she was a symbol of a world that had rejected him. When she uncovered his crimes and rejected him again, he burned everything. The locket wasn't just a trophy of a successful murder. It was the final possessive act of a twisted obsession. This changes the nature of the fight, Nahima said softly. It is not just about land and water. It is a battle of spirits. His twisted by hatred and yours bound by love. I don't know what it's bound by anymore, Mason confessed. For 3 years I've been bound by grief. Now, it feels like something else. Something colder. Vengeance is a cold fire, Nahima agreed. It can forge a weapon, but it cannot warm a home. Be careful it does not consume you, Mason Reed. Before he could reply, Tuluta approached them. She held out a small, smooth river stone. She wants you to have this, the girl said, her gaze distant. Who does? Mason asked. Your wife. Her spirit is strong now. She walks the path with us. She says this stone remembers the water. It will keep your heart from turning to ash. Mason took the stone. It was cool and solid in his hand. He wanted to dismiss her words as the fancies of a strange girl, but a part of him, a part he didn't recognize, accepted them. He slipped the stone into his pocket. As they drew closer to Copper Springs, they devised a plan. Mason would ride in openly. A U.S. Marshal pursuing the notorious Blackburn gang had legitimate business in the sheriff's territory. The sisters, using dyes made from berries and clay by Helona, would disguise themselves as Mexican traders, their proud Apache features softened and altered, their hair hidden beneath colorful shawls. Orenda's Spanish is flawless, Nahima explained. She will do the talking. We will be invisible. Nothing is invisible in a town like Copper Springs, Mason warned. Hayes will have eyes everywhere. And we will have ears, Kimla countered, a grim smile touching her lips for the first time. No one pays attention to the whispers of servant women and traders. On the final night before entering the town, they camped on a ridge overlooking the valley, where Copper Springs lay nestled, its lights twinkling like fallen stars. It looked peaceful, prosperous, a testament to Hayes's ambition. A beautiful lie, Nahima murmured, standing beside Mason. All lies are beautiful from a distance, he replied. He found himself studying her profile against the darkening sky, the strong line of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes. A strange sense of companionship had grown between them, forged in their shared purpose. She was nothing like Sarah. She was harder, more pragmatic, a survivor, shaped by the harsh realities of her world. Yet she possessed a similar core of unyielding strength. Tomorrow, she said, we enter the serpent's den. I've been in snake dens before, Mason said. But not one ruled by your wife's murderer, she reminded him gently. Remember what I said about the cold fire. Do not let your rage blind you. We need the hunter, not the widower. He nodded, appreciating the stark honesty of her warning. He looked down at the lights of the town where the man who had destroyed his life reigned as a king. Tomorrow the reckoning would begin. Copper Springs was an illusion of civilization. Its wide main street, lined with solid two-story brick buildings and a grand sandstone courthouse, was designed to project an image of permanence and order. But Mason felt the rot beneath the surface the moment he rode in. He saw it in the hard-eyed men who lounged on the boardwalks, their hands never far from their guns, men who looked less like townsfolk and more like hired muscle. He saw it in the nervous glances of the shopkeepers, the fear that flickered behind their polite smiles. This was Donovan Hayes's town, and everyone in it was either a subject or a prisoner. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, the imposing courthouse looming beside it. As he looped his reins around the hitching post, he saw the sisters across the square setting up a small stall of woven blankets and pottery. They looked the part, Orenda chattering in animated Spanish, while her sisters quietly arranged their wares. They were invisible, just as they'd planned. The sheriff's office was a shrine to its occupant. The oak desk was massive, the leather chairs expensive, and a large, detailed map of the territory dominated one wall, dotted with colored pins. Donovan Hayes rose to greet him, a portrait of polished charm. He was handsome in a severe way, with silver-streaked dark hair and a smile that was perfectly crafted, but reached nowhere near his cold, calculating eyes. Marshall Reed Hayes said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. He extended a hand. We received a wire about your pursuit of the Blackburn gang. A terrible business. Welcome to Copper Springs. How can we be of service? Mason shook his hand, feeling the latent power in the man's grip. Just following a lead sheriff. I have reason to believe Blackburn might be using this area as a base of operations. Entirely possible, Hayes said, gesturing for Mason to sit. This territory is rife with lawless elements. It's the very problem I intend to solve when I am elected to Congress. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. But you seem to have tracked them a long way. All the way from Redemption, I hear. The casual mention of the town sent a clear message. I know where you're coming from. I have my sources. News travels fast, Mason said, his expression impassive. In my town it does, Hayes smiled. I pride myself on being well informed. He exuded an air of intellectual superiority, his every word chosen to establish control. The conversation was a carefully orchestrated dance, a probing for weaknesses. Mason played his part, the weary but determined lawman, while every nerve ending screamed with the desire to draw his weapon and end it right there. He forced himself to see the mission, not the man. He spent the rest of the day going through the motions, interviewing merchants, checking the livery, creating the fiction of his investigation. All the while, he was aware of being watched. Hayes's deputies were a constant, subtle presence. Later, he checked into the hotel, a room Hayes had graciously arranged for him, and found the small, cleverly hidden peephole in the wall almost immediately. He was a fly in Hayes's spiderweb. That evening, he met Nahima in the moonless shadows behind the livery stable. "He knows more than he's letting on," Mason reported in a low voice. "He's playing with me." "My sisters have been listening," Nahima countered. "The town is preparing for a grand celebration. In 2 days, Hayes will officially announce his candidacy for Congress. Territorial officials will be here, and he plans to stage a public execution to mark the occasion." An execution. An Apache woman captured weeks ago. He's been saving her. He'll hang her as a symbol of his ability to bring law and order. The sheer cynical cruelty of it was breathtaking. While they spoke, Orenda slipped out of the darkness to join them. "There's more," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "I overheard Blackburn talking to a deputy. They have Sarah's letters, the ones she was bringing to Jonathan Burke, the local newspaper man. They took them from the fire." "Does Burke know anything?" Mason asked. "He's a ghost," Orenda said. "Drinks from sunup to sundown. They say he hasn't been the same since Hayes's men paid him a visit a few years back. Their plan had to change. The evidence they needed was likely in Hayes's possession. Their only chance was to create an opportunity to retrieve it. And Hayes, in his arrogance, was providing one. The celebration, Mason said, the idea forming in his mind. He'll have all his important guests there. His guard will be focused on protecting him. That's our moment. A moment for what Kimla demanded, appearing silently beside them, to walk into the lion's den. To burn it down from the inside, Nahima finished understanding Mason's line of thought. Over the next 36 hours, a new plan took shape, relayed in whispers and fleeting encounters. It was desperate, borderline suicidal. Halona, using her knowledge of plants, procured a potent fast-acting powder from a Chinese laundryman, a substance used in fireworks that, when mixed with dust and ignited, would create a thick, disorienting smoke. Tuluta, in her quiet, unnerving way, studied the town's layout, paying special attention to the large water tower that stood in the center of the square, fed by the very springs that gave the town its name. The day of the celebration arrived hot and breathless. A platform had been erected in front of the courthouse. Banners fluttered in the light breeze. The town's elite gathered dressed in their finest, fanning themselves in the oppressive heat. Mason took up a position across the square, leaning against a post, looking for all the world like a marshal, keeping a watchful eye on the proceedings. Inside his duster, Halona's smoke powder was packed into small leather pouches. Across the square, Nahima and Kimla, disguised as servants, moved through the crowd, carrying trays of drinks, their eyes missing nothing. Orenda and Halona were positioned near the alleyways, ready to create a diversion. Tuluta was nowhere to be seen. Hayes took the stage to thunderous applause. He was the very picture of a statesman, his voice booming with promises of progress and a secure future, a future free from the savage threat. As he spoke, Mason saw Blackburn standing near the side of the platform, a vigilant guard dog. The silver locket glinted on a chain around the big man's thick neck. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of cold rage through Mason. Hayes was reaching the crescendo of his speech. And as a symbol of this new era of security, We will now proceed with the lawful and just punishment of a murderous Apache raider. On cue, 2 deputies dragged a woman toward a hastily constructed gallows. It was the captured Apache woman. This was the signal. From an alley, Orenda and Halona ignited a pile of refuse, sending a plume of black smoke into the air, shouting, "Fire!" At the same instant, Mason ripped open his pouches and hurled them into the dust at the crowd's edge. The effect was instantaneous. A series of sharp pops was followed by a massive rolling cloud of thick gray smoke that billowed across the square, engulfing the stage and the gallows. Panic erupted. The crowd surged, coughing and blind. In the chaos, Kimla and Nahima moved. Kimla, with a warrior's speed, cut the bound woman free from the gallows, disappearing with her into the swirling smoke. Nahima, meanwhile, sprinted toward the distracted deputies, disabling them with swift, brutal efficiency. Mason's target was Blackburn. He plunged into the smoke, his world reduced to gray shapes and terrified screams. He found Blackburn near the stage, trying to protect Hayes. Mason crashed into him, driving him to the ground. They rolled in the dust, a tangle of limbs and fury. Mason's only focus was the glint of silver. He grabbed for the locket, his fingers closing around the chain. Blackburn roared, landing a brutal punch to Mason's side that sent a starburst of pain through his ribs. Suddenly, a strange, deep groaning sound echoed through the square, a sound of stressed wood and metal. The great water tower in the center of the square shuddered, then tilted its support legs, inexplicably splintering. With a terrifying crash, it collapsed, sending a tidal wave of water surging through the square, turning the dust to mud and sweeping people off their feet. The flood slammed into the stage, splintering the platform and sending Hayes and Blackburn tumbling. In the chaos of smoke and water, Mason found his feet. He saw Blackburn struggling to rise, disoriented. He saw the locket ripped free in their struggle, lying in the mud. He lunged for it, his fingers closing around the cool metal just as Hayes, his face a mask of incandescent fury, found his footing and drew his pistol. Reed Hayes screamed, his polished veneer stripped away to reveal the raw hatred beneath. But before he could aim, Nahima was there. She had retrieved a deputy's fallen rifle, and she fired not to kill, but to disarm. The shot was perfect, striking the gun from Hayes's hand. The smoke was beginning to clear. Deputies were regrouping. Mason knew they had only seconds. He grabbed Nahima's arm. "Go get the others. Meet at the canyon." He turned back for one last look. Hayes was on his knees in the mud, staring at his empty hand, and then at Mason, his eyes promising a murderous retribution. Blackburn was gone, having vanished into the chaos. Mason clutched the locket in his fist and ran, melting into the pandemonium his alliance had unleashed. He had Sarah's locket back, but the fight was far from over. He had merely kicked open the serpent's den. Now he had to kill the snake. The retreat from Copper Springs was a desperate, scattered flight. Mason created a false trail heading north before doubling back under the cover of the chaotic night to the predetermined rendezvous point, Dead Horse Canyon. He found the sisters there, tending to the rescued Apache woman Ayana, who turned out to be their cousin. They were all accounted for, shaken but resolute. Tuluta, Mason said, turning to the youngest sister who sat calmly by a smokeless fire. "The water tower." She simply smiled, a small, enigmatic expression. "The water was angry," she said. "I only suggested where it should fall." "We struck the heart of his power," Nahima said, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "But we also showed him our hand. He knows who we are and what we are capable of. He will hunt us with everything he has." "Let him come," Kimla said, sharpening her knife on a whetstone. The sound was a soft, menacing hiss in the quiet canyon. Mason opened his hand and stared at the locket, its silver surface smeared with mud. He cleaned it carefully with a piece of cloth, the familiar weight of it a comfort and an agony. He had the symbol back, But the man who had ordered his wife's death was still alive, his power unbroken. The vengeance Nahima had warned him about was a living thing inside him demanding satisfaction. Their sanctuary did not last long. At dawn on the second day, the scouts returned. Not 2 this time, but 20. A war party composed of Hayes's deputies, hired guns, and the very Apache trackers who had betrayed their own people. And at their head, 2 figures, Sheriff Donovan Hayes, his fine suit replaced by practical buckskins, and Samuel Blackburn, his face a thunderous mask of rage. "He has us trapped," Orenda stated, her voice tight with tension as she peered from their lookout post. "The only way out of this box canyon is through them." "Then through them we shall go," Kimla declared, checking the action on her rifle. Mason looked at the formidable force arrayed at the canyon's mouth. A direct assault was suicide. He scanned the canyon walls, the ancient burial niches, the crumbling sandstone cliffs. His hunter's eye sought an advantage, a different path. "We don't go through them," Mason said, an idea taking shape. "We bring the mountain down on them." He pointed to a high, unstable-looking rock spire that loomed directly over the canyon entrance. For the next few hours, they worked with frantic, silent purpose. Using their ropes, Mason and Kimla scaled the treacherous cliff face, finding a position near the base of the spire. The others gathered what dry brush and deadwood they could find, piling it into the crevices and faults in the rock at the spire's foundation. It was a desperate gamble. If the fire didn't weaken the rock enough, or if it fell the wrong way, their trap would fail, leaving them exposed and helpless. As the sun reached its zenith, Hayes's party began its advance, moving cautiously into the narrow canyon. They were walking directly into the kill zone. From his perch high above, Mason looked down at the man who had destroyed his life. He saw the arrogance in Hayes's posture, the certainty of his victory. The cold fire of vengeance burned in Mason's chest, demanding he take the shot to end it with a single bullet. But he looked over at Kimla, her face set in grim determination, and thought of Nahima and her sisters below. This was for all of them. Justice, not just personal revenge. Now he mouthed to Kimla. They both fired, not at the men below, but into the tinder-dry brush packed at the base of the spire. The brush caught instantly, flames licking up the side of the rock. Below, Hayes's men reacted with confusion, firing up at the cliffs. Bullets ricocheted around Mason and Kimla, showering them with stone fragments. The fire roared, the intense heat causing the sandstone to crack and groan. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like the world splitting apart, the massive rock spire shuddered and leaned and began to fall. A wave of panicked shouts rose from below as Hayes's men tried to scramble back, but it was too late. The spire crashed down directly into the mouth of the canyon, a cataclysm of shattering rock and dust. The landslide it created was immense, completely sealing the entrance, burying half of Hayes's force in an instant. When the dust began to settle, the canyon was silent. The war party was gone, either crushed or trapped on the other side of an impassable wall of rock. But their victory was short-lived. A single hate-filled shout echoed from within the canyon. Read. Hayes had survived. He and a handful of his men, including Blackburn, had been far enough into the canyon to escape the rockfall. Now they were trapped inside. With them. The final battle had begun. The canyon itself was the arena. What followed was a brutal running gunfight through the labyrinth of stone and shadow. The sisters, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, became predators in their own land. Halona and Ayana laid false trails. Orenda and Toluta set up ambushes. Mason, Kimla, and Nahima became the primary hunters stalking the hunters. One by one, Hayes's men fell victims of a silent arrow, a well-placed shot from a hidden ledge, or the deadly slash of Kimla's knife in the close-quarters confusion of the narrow passages. Finally, only two remained, Hayes and Blackburn. They cornered them in a small circular clearing, a sacred space, with a single withered tree at its center. It was a place of judgment. Blackburn, seeing the hopeless odds, made his move. "This was all him," he yelled, pointing a bloody finger at Hayes. "I was just taking orders. I'll tell you everything." Hayes's response was to turn and fire his last bullet into his lieutenant's chest. Blackburn crumpled to the ground, a look of shocked betrayal on his face. As he fell, the silver locket swung free, landing in the dust near his outstretched hand. Now it was just Hayes. He stood alone, his fine clothes torn and bloodied, his carefully constructed persona stripped away, leaving only the hateful cornered animal beneath. So he spat, throwing his empty pistol aside and drawing a large Bowie knife. "It comes to this, the half-breed against the hunter. Which one of you wants to die first?" "This is for my father," Kimla snarled, raising her rifle. "No," Mason said, stepping forward, his own pistol holstered. He drew the knife he'd used to cut them down from the tree. "This one is mine." Nahima put a restraining hand on her sister's arm. She understood. This was more than a battle. It was an exorcism. Hayes laughed, a raw, unhinged sound. "You think you can take me, Reed?" "The great Apache hunter I learned to fight in these canyons before you ever saw one." They circled each other, two men reduced to the most primal form of conflict. The sisters watched a silent chorus of witnesses. Mason saw only the man who had ordered Sarah's death, who had held her locket as a trophy. The cold fire of vengeance surged, demanding a bloody end. But as he looked into Hayes's eyes, he saw not a monster, but a man hollowed out by his own self-loathing. A man who had destroyed everything he touched because he could not accept himself. He remembered Nahima's words. "Be careful it does not consume you." He remembered Tuluta's stone, cool and solid, in his pocket. He thought of Sarah, not her death, but her life, her belief in a justice that was more than just retribution. He had a choice. He could kill Hayes, satisfying the ghost of vengeance that had ridden him for 3 years. Or he could be the man Sarah had believed him to be, a man of law, a man of justice. The choice was made for him. Hayes, seeing a flicker of hesitation, lunged his knife, slashing for Mason's throat. Mason parried, the clash of steel echoing in the silent clearing. They grappled, a desperate struggle of strength and will. Hayes was strong, fueled by a lifetime of rage, but Mason was relentless. He disarmed Hayes, sending the knife spinning into the dust. He landed a heavy blow to the man's jaw, sending him stumbling back. Mason stood over him, his knife at Hayes's throat. He had him, helpless. He saw the flash of the fire, heard Sarah's scream in his memory. His hand tightened. "Do it." Hayes goaded, a bloody smile on his lips. "Become what you hunted. Be a killer." Mason looked past him at the locket lying in the dust. He looked at Nahima, her dark eyes watching him, waiting. He made his decision. He pulled his knife back and delivered a precise, disabling blow to Hayes's shoulder, and then knocked him unconscious with the hilt of his blade. He stood breathing heavily, the fire of vengeance finally extinguished, leaving behind not emptiness, but a quiet, painful clarity. He was a marshal of the United States, and he had a prisoner to deliver. The aftermath was a slow, difficult journey back to a world that had been irrevocably changed. A territorial judge dispatched to investigate the chaos in Copper Springs met them on the trail. The evidence from Sarah's journal, combined with the testimony of Ayanna and the sisters, was undeniable. The empire Donovan Hayes had built on blood and lies crumbled. His network of corrupt officials was exposed, and the truth of the massacres came to light. The water maps their knowledge, now held by Nahima, became a point of negotiation. She, with Mason at her side, proposed a revolutionary idea, a water commission made up of territorial and Apache representatives, to manage the resources for the good of all, not the profit of a few. It was the beginning of a new fragile peace. Weeks later, Mason stood before a new grave at the mission of San Xavier del Bac. Sarah's remains had been moved here to a place of quiet dignity. He opened his hand. The silver locket rested on his palm, clean and gleaming. He had recovered it from the dust of Dead Horse Canyon, a symbol of the end of his long hunt. He had his vengeance. Hayes was imprisoned awaiting a trial that would surely lead to the gallows. But Mason felt no triumph. The revenge hadn't healed the wound. It had only cauterized it, leaving a scar as profound as the one on his face. He had thought that retrieving the locket would bring Sarah back, but she was gone. The locket was just a thing of silver and memory. He thought of the future, the offer to head the new Water Commission's Enforcement Division, the long, difficult road ahead, trying to build bridges between two worlds. He thought of Nahima, of the quiet strength and understanding that had grown between them, a fragile green shoot in the barren landscape of his grief. With a final deep breath, he reached out and gently placed the silver locket on Sarah's headstone, resting it against the cool granite. It was an act of letting go. Not of her memory, but of the all-consuming grief and vengeance that had defined him. He was no longer the hunter. He was no longer just the widower. He was something new. He turned from the grave and looked out across the valley toward the mountains where Nahima and her sisters were working to rebuild their people's lives. The sun was setting, painting the desert in hues of rose and gold. A new day was coming. He took a step and then another, walking toward it,